Hi, so I'm Hal. Welcome and welcome back to my channel. Today I just wanted to talk about all the books that I read in January. I did end up reading 10 books in January, which is a lot. In my defense, a lot of them were quite short, and also I was going through things, which is the only, I think, reason why I did that. And I'm quite consistent with my reading in general, but yeah. And I think also I finished a couple of things like very early on in January that I was obviously reading in December, which definitely I think affected the overall kind of count there. The first book that I ended up finishing in January was Swordcrossed by Freya Marske. So this is like an adult gay fantasy romance, like it's set in a fantastical world. There isn't really any magic or anything like that. I have read Freya Marks's other books last year, and I had kind of like mixed feelings, but I was interested in picking this up. And yeah, so we're following our main character, Matinesh or Matty J, who is kind of the eldest son and acting head of the J family, who make woolen fabric in this world where there's a lot of like different guilds, and his father is kind of head of the guild, so he's having to look after kind of the family business, which is not doing very well. So at the beginning of the book, he ends up in this like arranged political marriage with Sophia Cooper, who is, you know, a childhood friend. Her family makes wine, I believe. In this world is that for big events, so things like births, there's a naming day ceremony, joining a guild, and marriages, you have these kind of ceremonial kind of sword people. Ceremonial kind of sword fights at these events, so you hire like fencers basically to act as guards. Obviously in a marriage it is kind of then folded into the like, do you object to this match kind of thing, and because Sophia does have someone who is interested in her, Matty is very much like, I need to get the right person for this job. And he ends up through, you know, a series of events, end up hiring this guy called Luca Pierre, who is new to town and did recently scam Matty out of 200 gold. So we start off on the wrong foot with these two, and then they kind of grow closer together through, you know, the deal that they make at the beginning of the book where Luca is going to represent Matty at his wedding, but Matty also wants to learn how to sword fight, so they keep having these kind of sword fighting things. We start to learn a little bit more about kind of Matty's family situation. They start to investigate a little bit of things together, and all along they're getting closer, but Luca is definitely hiding kind of some things that are going on. This was really fun. There was a lot of like politicking, you know, guild stuff, descriptions about like making fabric and wool and things like that, which I'm obviously really into. I love to knit. I knitted this sweater vest, you know. I love details like that. I also did guess a couple of the plot twists going into this book, but in a very like fun, like, I'm sure that this is gonna happen, and then it did, and I felt funny and smart about it. Some other things I didn't guess going in, but it definitely added to kind of that fun time. The only real problem that I had with this book is that it is incredibly horny. Like, why are we 20% of the way into this book and there's fingers in people's mouths? That was an issue for me, because that's not the type of book that I like to read generally. I am really glad that we get these, like, gay, horny books, and, you know, like that probably implies, there are quite a few sex scenes in this as well. I'm so glad that this is, you know, a thing that's available for queer books now, but I like my pining to be less fingers in people's mouths and more, you know, longing, I guess. But yeah, I had a really fun time. This got me in the doorway to my friend's room on various occasions, monologuing about this book. So yeah, it was really fun. I gave this 4 stars. It was a fun time. 10 out of 10, you know. Some notes, but had a great time. The next book that I finished as well was Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. This is a reread of I was doing a reread of the whole series last year as audiobooks. I'd read Gideon and Harrow quite early on, and then there was a huge wait list for the Nona the Ninth audiobook, and I finally got it and listened to it. This is the third book in the Locked Tomb series, which is an adult kind of sci-fi series. It's difficult to describe because so many things happen in this book series, but we are kind of following a different character throughout all of these books. In the first one, in Gideon, she is basically one of the few young people on her planet, and she fucking hates Harrow, who is the other young person on her planet, and she's desperately trying to leave. And they make a deal at the beginning of the book that if Gideon, goes with Harrow to this, competition setting, and she'll be able to get her freedom afterwards, so they need to work together so that Harrow can become kind of a lictor in this world. Don't worry about it. It gets explained. Things obviously get a lot more complicated. There's a lot of things going on. In this book, we're following Nona, who is 6 months old, and she loves you. TM. But yeah, some of this book is basically people around Nona trying to work out who she is, who is in the body that woke up this time. It's a lot of, we really open up the world that we are living in kind of thing, both with the storyline following Nona and some interjections from some other characters as well. This was really interesting. I felt like it was a lot stronger on a reread because I actually knew kind of what was going on and who these people were, if that makes sense. And yeah, I just think that this book series is really fun. All of these characters in this are really strong. There are people in here that, I knew what was going to happen because I read it already, and I still got incredibly emotional about, all the things that was going on with this book. It is quite, slow to start, I would say, but a lot of action in the end. A fun time. I would recommend the whole series, but I do think that Nona really flourished on a reread, and I had a great time, and now I just have to continue waiting in limbo for Electo. I think the first time that I read this, I gave it 4 stars, and I wasn't going to change that rating based on my reread, so that's where it is, but that's not a new rating that I've given this book or anything like that. The next book that I read was Arch-Conspirator by Veronica Roth. I think the fact that this is so small definitely added to my total of books this year. This is a sci-fi novella, which is kind of an exploration and a retelling of Antigone, but in this futuristic, dystopian kind of world. I've not actually read Antigone, but when I was a young person in a youth theatre company, one time they got us to learn monologues for kind of a pseudo audition that we were doing. And I remember picking up this book that had a version of Antigone's monologue in it that was rewritten in kind of a more modern English, and it had such an impact on me. I still remember parts of this monologue to this day, and I've never been able to find it again, so it's literally just from that, one time reading it, and I might have had a photocopy of it or something like that. So I know enough about Antigone to know about the monologue and to know that it's kind of, it's about grief and family. And oh boy, was I reading this in a time of grief and family. So I really enjoyed this. I think the novella brings up a lot of ideas that it doesn't really fully explore. So there's in this world, basically, we're in a dystopia. There's an archive which keeps the Ica of every dead person so that they can be reincarnated by being placed in a womb, or we seem to be in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster, but that's not really explained. There's obviously the events of, I assume, the play Antigone going on, an attempt revolution and things like that. So yeah, things aren't really explained, but the vibes were there, and this really worked for me, is what I'm gonna say. I loved all the ideas that were explored here. I think it was done really well, but obviously if you are wanting things to be fully explained, this is not the book for you, this is not the short novella for you, but it really worked for me, and it felt like it hit with what it was trying to say. I would say that it is quite similar to When Among Crows, that it is in that 3-4 star category, but because I think it just hit me at the right time and I really enjoyed it, so I'm going to give it 4 stars. It's something that it's been in the back of my mind, I would say, and I think it really worked for the time that I was reading it there. The next book that I read was What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher. Don't worry if there's a theme coming on, I was going through it. This is the second book in the Sworn Soldier series, so it's another little kind of short horror novella as well. In this one we follow Alec Easton, and he's going back to their homeland of Glancia to kind of fix up a little hunting lodge that they own, so that they can host some of the characters from that last book. And basically, once we get there, we find out that the caretaker of that lodge has died under kind of mysterious circumstances. No one in the town wants to really talk about it. And we do end up getting some new people to live there, and basically things kind of get more complicated as this possible kind of spirit is there. I really enjoyed this one, especially because we were playing a bit more with like Eastern folklore rather than it being a straight retelling of a story. I think that really worked in its favour. Immediately I had less issues with it trying to do the House of Usher but better, and failing because the House of Usher stands on its own really well. The other thing is that we have less moments of phonetically spelling out an accent, which again, big improvement in its standing. There were a couple of moments where people said things and I was like, that doesn't sound right to me. But yeah, I think overall it did a really fun thing with the concept. I liked the horror elements in this, and I gave it 3 stars. I had a good time, I liked it. The next books that I read I'm going to talk about together because they are book 1 and book 2 in a series, which is the Archived and then the Unbound by B.E. Schwab. This was me searching through Libby trustfully trying to find something that interested me a little bit whilst I was waiting for other holds to come in. These are urban fantasy kind of YA books where the idea behind this is that once people die, their kind of history, capital H, kind of gets recorded, and they are kept as like, there's a copy of their body inside this like library archive to kind of keep a record of everyone who's, I guess, ever lived. There's basically the setup is you have the real world, you have the library archive, and then in between you have these like corridors. And the job of keepers is to move between the real world into the corridors, find any of these histories that have woken up and managed to get out, and take them back into the archive before they get too confused and violent and potentially escape into the real world. We follow our main character, Mackenzie Bishop, who is a keeper, and she's kind of, you know, she's one of the youngest to ever do it kind of thing. And she has to try and balance her personal life with this kind of secret life that she has in a very, 2000 paranormal YA move. This is made a lot more complicated by the fact that Mackenzie has recently lost her younger brother, and both her and her parents are dealing with this loss in different ways. At the beginning of this book, she moves into this kind of previously a hotel, now sets of apartment, and she is dealing with a lot more histories kind of getting loose, which puts obviously more stress on her. And she makes friends with someone called Wesley, and again, things get a little bit more complicated there when she, with her struggles with kind of grief and her role as a keeper and, work, family, life stress, etc. This was fun. I definitely enjoyed it. There is a romantic relationship that turns up in this where I was just like, why is this here? Where has this come from? Okay. But I loved the vibes. The vibes were great. The characters were fun. There was a family, like a found familyness to some of the like people who worked in the archive and things like that, which I thought was really nice to see. But I do think it could have gone a little bit further with the ideas that are presented. I also then read The Unbound, I think directly afterwards, which is the sequel. In this one, Mackenzie has just started at a new kind of private school, and she's still struggling with kind of the aftermath and the trauma of the things that happened at the end of the first book, which were quite dramatic. and also people who have been connected to Mackenzie also start to disappear in kind of mysterious ways. When this book started and we got introduced to the school and we got introduced to like the club of misfits at the school, I was really excited for this to kind of be all in the way, more in the way of the like misfit weirdos at school YA books, but this was much more of like a paranormal investigation book, which like was fun. I do think that this was dealing with some quite heavy like mental health topics as well and things like that, and I think those were done like pretty well. I just would have enjoyed more of the misfit losers at school hijinks, which I thought I was going to get when they got introduced. But overall, I did have a good time. I rated both of these books 3 stars. I do think that the idea was there to be a third book in the trilogy, which has not been written, and I don't think V. Schwab is going to go back to this world, to be fair, with how long ago these were written. I think it's really interesting, like, looking back at this author's work, because I've obviously read other things by her, and how it, you know, there's definitely that writing style is still very emblematic of what she does write, but I do feel like she has found her footing in other ways, and I don't think she would have written this kind of story now, especially with the types of story that she does write. There was a very compactness to this story is what I would say. Like, I do enjoy the relationship that develops a bit more in the second book, but I don't think that she would be writing those romantic relationships at this point in her life kind of thing. The next book that I finished was Dark Star Burning, Ash Falls White by Amelie Wen Zhao. This is a sequel to Song of Silver Flame Like Night, which is kind of like a YA fantasy that is very like wuxia Xianxia inspired, which if you don't know what that means, it's the historical like fantasy Chinese cultivators kind of thing. Think The Untamed. Think these guys, you know, the pretty long-haired boys in long robes doing magic. That's the kind of vibe. We start off this story in the first book in a world where there is ongoing colonization by people called the Atlanteans, and our main character Lan starts off as like a song girl in like this house where she's meant to entertain people, and following a chance encounter with a boy called Zen, it opens up the chance for her to kind of tap into some like, you know, the like key abilities that she does have. They end up traveling to a kind of a hidden school for cultivation, and it does follow that quite kind of traditional cultivation school storyline. I'm so sorry if you've not seen anything like The Untamed, this will mean absolutely nothing to you, but I was like, oh, I absolutely know where we're going when I was reading this first book. Lan and Zen continue getting closer, and there's various kind of secrets and things going on there. They get more complicated. I really did enjoy the first book in this series. I gave it 4 stars, and I felt like we left off at a really interesting place. In this book, we are in kind of that post-school trying to, you know, we found out some more information about one of the forces of power in this world, which is these 4 demon gods, and Lan is trying to kind of collect all 4 of these so that, you know, there's kind of this trying to defeat the Atlanteans, but also she's very much kind of trying to save the world from them kind of thing. I struggle with this book in that very much way of, you know how some people talk about, you know, a trilogy and say these last 2 books could have really been one because there isn't a lot happening. I felt the opposite with this book. I felt like this was 2 books that had been smushed together, and therefore there was no time to let any of the emotional beats of these books actually build and hit. At the end of the book, there is a big betrayal. I don't believe that Lan in this book has the time to really struggle with that betrayal and kind of get to the point that she does at the point in the book where she feels those things. In the middle of the book, we're kind of introduced to a new character. It's, you know, he's positioned as very much like a possible like second book love interest that's actually hiding some things and isn't the guy that we think he is. There's a bit of like something isn't right in this city kind of thing going on. before we kind of reveal his true motives. And it feels like a climax, but it's in the middle of this like 370-page book, so it does not have the time to breathe for it to actually be impactful. I was just like, yeah, he's gonna turn up to be a bad guy because we need to get to the end of this book and we're gonna finish this whole story. And yeah, I also just had some problems with how the main relationship plays out and how the epilogue goes. It was very in line with keeping with a lot of like other YA stories. Why is there one off-page sex scene after a marriage type thing, and which leads to a kid being born in this Chinese-inspired book? Like, that feels very Christian-coded to me. I did enjoy every time that we were talking about the demon gods and things like that. And at the end of the day, you know, that's much more what I wanted to read about. I did end up giving this book 2 stars because I just thought it was okay at the end of the day. I had some issues with it, had some bits that I enjoyed. I do think that the pacing really struggled in this book, and that's why I ended up giving it that rating. The next book that I finished was The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is an adult fantasy kind of novel. It's really interesting how this was kind of written and how this reads. We're following our main character who is kind of in this world where there's an ongoing kind of war that we don't know a huge amount, and he's been told by his grandmother about this like unseen theatre that you get to go to kind of once in your life. And at the beginning of the book, he gets the chance, he wakes up at this unseen theatre, and they put on this play, and the play is kind of the story of these 2 men who end up ending the kind of tyrannical dynasty that was occurring in that world, and this is kind of in the past of our, you know, current day main character kind of thing. And as the play is on stage, we're getting the story kind of told to us, and, you know, there's kind of little asides from our main character watching the story, who's relating things that he's seeing to kind of experiences that he's had, or stories that, you know, his grandmother told him, or how he told this story to his like siblings. And then even when we are following those main characters in that story that's being told, we're also getting little asides from like the people they meet on the road, and stuff like that, where we get their thoughts about what the events are happening in this story. And I thought that that was such an interesting way to tell this story. I thought it really worked as an audiobook because we're playing with that medium of storytelling and who's telling this story and how things are told, especially because we're watching it play inside of this story. And yeah, I think it was done really well because you're able to follow the story even though we do have all of this like perspective shifting and everything like that. And I thought that that was really interesting and it was really well done. However, I feel like I ultimately didn't really connect with the story that was being told as much as I would have loved to. So this was only kind of a 3-star read from me. The next book that I finished was Nettle Bone by Kingfisher, which is an adult kind of fantasy novella where we follow Mara, who is the youngest of 3 kind of princesses who has spent the majority of her life in a convent to kind of not be an issue to the line of succession, who discovers that the prince who married first her elder sister and then her middle sister when her elder sister passed away has actually been probably the cause of death for her elder sister and is abusing her middle sister. And so she sets out to gain the power that she needs to get rid of this prince and save her middle sister. Part of the reason that I picked this up is because, again, I was looking through things that were available to me via my library, and on Libby this had been marked as like borrowed with like the tagging system, and I had absolutely no memory of this book, and there was no record of me reading this book via anything else that I used to track my reading. And I think what must have happened is I accidentally sampled this book before the tagging for like sampling a book and borrowing a book was different. But I had to know what was going on in this book, and I'm glad that I did because I did have a fun time. This is very much like a fairy tale-y vibe book. When we meet Mara, she's trying to complete these 3 impossible tasks. so that she can have the help of a dust witch or a dust wife to kind of help her, you know, get rid of this prince kind of thing. And it continues in very much a similar way. They have to go to a fairy market. There's a dog made out of bones. There are magical godmothers who can, you know, curse or bless children. And yeah, I thought it was a really kind of fun little tale. I liked Mara as a character a lot. She's like in her mid-30s, and to me, she's incredibly autistic coded. I love an autistic coded nun. And yeah, I thought it was fun. I definitely enjoyed the little bit of romance that she does get to have, especially because of the above being in her mid-30s and, you know, reading to me as autistic. Had a fun time. I gave this 3 stars. And then the last book that I read this month was Empire of Ivory by Naomi Novik. This is the 4th book in the Temeraire series. I finally got another book out from the library. My fight is momentarily over. So this is kind of like a fantasy alternate history kind of Napoleonic Wars book where our main character, Captain William Lawrence, he ends up gaining this dragon egg that was meant to go to Napoleon, and it hatches and he then becomes, you know, bonded with this dragon called Temeraire, and he gets thrown into this world of aviators and the fight against Napoleon from this kind of dragon-back situation. In this book, we are returning back to England after the events of the previous 2 books where they had gone to China and then gone back, you know, they were back in Europe via like Turkey, via the Ottoman Empire. And they come back and they basically, whilst they've been away, there's been this epidemic of disease that are facing the English dragons that have left the fighting force absolutely decimated. A lot of dragons have passed away, and those that are still alive are in a really bad state. Things get a little bit more complicated once we realise that Temeraire is immune to this disease, and possibly part of that reason that he got better is because he ate something that was kind of a cure when they were on that journey to China originally in South Africa. So they have to go back to South Africa and investigate and try and find what it was that helped Temeraire so that it can heal the rest of the dragons kind of in Temeraire's squad and eventually all the rest of the dragons in England. This was a lot of fun. I do feel like Naomi Novik does a really good job with the historical settings and the history and just the vibes that entails. We're having conversations in this book both about like abolition of the slave trade, and also before we, you know, go to, this is I think a bit more before we go to Africa, we're having, you know, conversations about trying to abolish the slave trade. Lawrence's father is kind of doing part of that. There's conversations with Wilberforce as well. And also we're trying to improve the like animal husbandry for dragons, you know. Maybe we shouldn't be making our sick dragons sleep on the cold wet earth and should be building, you know, buildings for them to rest in and things like that. Whilst the Admiralty does not see the value in doing things like this. It does feel like both Temeraire and Lawrence are working together as a team to try and improve things for people, and that was really fun because I do think that that's one of the most important relationships in this book. I thought that the sections in Africa were really interesting. I obviously can't speak to how well they are, you know, the tribes that are portrayed and discussed are done, but all of the characters that we do meet do feel like, you know, people. They have complex cultures and languages, and they are reacting to the, you know, horrors of the slave trade in realistic ways, even if that means that they are causing problems for our white main characters, you know, understandably. I don't know, I just had a really fun time. There's this hysterical bit where basically one of the species of dragons only bonds to women. So there are these female aviators and kind of, you know, there's a girl who's part of Lawrence's team. His father ends up meeting her at like one of these events, and he becomes convinced that this is like Lawrence's like out of wedlock daughter kind of thing, which is an incredible like weird energy between him and his parents. To make it more complicated, he is like, does have a sexual relationship with this girl's mother, who is like one of the other captains, and he's just in this like wild situation where he can't be like, no, I have no relationship with this girl, because then he would have to explain why he has a girl, like, you know, why Amelie is around him and knows him, because the real answer is she's part of his crew, because the idea is when she gets older and her mother passes away, she's gonna inherit her mother's dragon. And it's like, this is insane. Like, it's a family drama just plopped into this book. Had a great time. In general, I do really enjoy these books. I think this one was, just because it was so fun and it was so engaging the whole time, I did end up giving this one 4 stars rather than 3 stars as I've done the rest of the series. But yeah, maybe absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I just had a better time with this one. So yeah, that is everything that I read this past month. Hopefully I went through everything at a reasonable pace. In terms of what I'm reading currently, I am, reading the next Temeraire book, which is Victory of Eagles, which I'm having a good time with. And then I'm also reading The Haunting Season, which is a collection of short stories in the same vein as Winter Spirits. It has some of the same authors in. It's another one of those short story collections that has Natasha Pulley in. But I thought it was available at my library. I thought it would be best to read it before we leave winter completely, because otherwise I would have to have waited until next winter to really read this in like that cold, spooky time of year. But yeah, that's, I think, everything that I wanted to discuss today. I hope that you are also reading some nice things and having, everything's going well. Bye!